Hi, if you're new to the channel and you've come across my introduction video, welcome. So this is exactly the sort of subject I tend to talk about, big geopolitical current affairs, although I do cover other things as well. Very briefly, if you have just joined the channel, just to be clear, I have on previous occasions been sympathetic to Israel, but honestly, my sentiments in recent months, that sympathy has really waned, and I find myself increasingly disgusted by what Israel is doing and those who continue to excuse it. I think it is unconscionable, and I think it's morally unjustified what Israel is doing. But I just put it out there that that's not always been my position. There's been times I have defended Israel. I'm just putting it out there. Feel free to look at the history of my channel. You'll see where my stances has lay in the past. In fact, on October the 7th, I admit that I had a little Israeli flag on my profile. That's how strongly I felt about it. But what it's been doing since then, what we're seeing is collective punishment and, if not genocide, at the very least, ethnic cleansing. Abomination. So, with that in mind, I welcome today's developments. I welcome the fact that the UK has finally started to take a much tougher stance on this. Previously, with limited arms sales, but today there's been a joint statement with Canada and France. I think in my last video on the subject, I mentioned with the Netherlands, it was with Canada and France, condemning Israel's actions. And that's led to fiery exchanges in the House of Commons between Foreign Secretary David Lammy and the Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel. I'll briefly mention that it is in the article that I'm going to read out, and I'll put a link in the video as I often do. Patel started off shamefully by saying that the government stance is welcomed by Hamas. That's basically regurgitating Israeli propaganda. Even if technically it's true, even if Hamas has welcomed it, that doesn't change the fact that it's morally the right thing to do. So for her to open up with that, rather than to share condemnation of the excesses, is an absolute disgrace. And she was shaking her head angrily as Lammy was accusing her of refusing to condemn what Israel's doing. What I was encouraged by was the fact that, they say sometimes in politics it's important that politicians are calm and they don't show any emotions. I'm not sure about that. I think sometimes it can show a human side. And I think that the fact that David Lammy was visibly angry showed that he genuinely believes that they do need to speak up on what Israel is doing, rather than it just being a super diplomatic thing of, well, we believe that we should condemn Israel and, being super cautious. Lamy was quite blunt in his language. He wasn't holding back. And he was saying on this side of the house, we believe it's morally wrong. And he pointed out that there's conservatives who agree. And that's true. There are conservatives starting to speak out against the Netanyahu administration. It's worth pointing out it is Israel itself. There's increasing anti-war sentiments. There's increasing sentiments from the hostages' families against what Netanyahu is doing. I think one of the biggest distortions of this situation is viewing it through the prism of Jews and non-Jews. As many Jewish people condemn the Israeli government. That's one thing. Um, I think the issue here is about a far right government in Tel Aviv under Netanyahu. I think the issue is also that people are seeing this for what it is, collective punishment, and a situation where Palestinians are deemed to be less worthy than Israelis. And I think people are increasingly feeling this cannot be morally justified. Now, I'm under no illusions. I'm going to read out the article in a minute if you just bear with me. There's still quite a lot of right wing voices in this country that are blindly supportive of Israel, just blind support no matter what. They're out there. I don't know whether they're majority or a minority or what, they're vocal, right? YouGov polls have found that actually the British public are not apathetic, but there's not a majority support, there's not a strong support for either the Israelis or Palestinians. That's interesting. But where the polls have been conducted, or as to where the favour lies, it's slightly more towards the Palestinians. I do think that some of the pro-Palestinian marches haven't been entirely constructive. I think people waving little parachute signals and so on, and yes, praising Hamas have damaged that movement. But as Lammy rightly pointed out, calling for an end to the starvation of civilians, calling for civilians to get aid, etc., is not supporting Hamas. And I think it's pretty shameful for Patel to go down that line. She claims that she uh, agreed with some of the government's positions, or not even agreed, she understood some of the government positions. But I think it says it all that she felt the need to open with that line. I think history will look very unkindly on those who support what Israel's doing right now. With that being said, I'm going to read out the article. I'll put a link to that video because it's an interesting exchange. But I welcome what the government's doing. I do think it's overdue, long overdue, and I'd like to see it go further and completely halt arms to Israel. But this is the toughest stance we've seen so far. And this report's by Jennifer McKiernan and James Lansdale in the BBC. The UK has suspended talks on a trade deal with Israel, summoned the country's ambassador, and imposed fresh sanctions on West Bank settlers, as Foreign Secretary David Lammy described the military escalation in Gaza as morally unjustifiable. This is the toughest stance this government's taken so far. The move follows warnings of starvation in Gaza after Israel launched a new military operation over the weekend. There were fiery exchanges in Parliament with Conservative Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel, who suggested the actions would be welcomed by Hamas, but also angry calls for the government to go further. In response, Israel's foreign spokesman said external pressure will not divert Israel from its path of defending its existence. Well, that's the excuse it's using for um, yeah, I don't think self-defense can be used to justify some of the things it's doing. Global experts have warned of a looming famine because the Israeli government has blockaded supplies of food, fuel, and medicine into Gaza for the last 11 weeks. Officials say the sheer scale of the humanitarian crisis after 2 months of blockade played a part in the latest announcement, as did growing pressure from MPs and the public. Ministers are also responding to the lack of any clear path towards a ceasefire and a sense of frustration from the White House, with President Trump sidestepping the country on his Middle East tour last week and Vice President Vance postponing a trip there this week. That's saying something. Even Donald Trump and JD Vance are getting frustrated with Israel. I think that is saying something. The Israeli government has already been warned it must end its egregious military expansion and immediately allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza in a joint statement from the leaders of the UK, Canada, and France on Monday. Israel said it allowed 5 lorries carrying humanitarian aid into the territory, but the UN's humanitarian chief said this was a drop in the ocean of what is urgently needed. Later on Tuesday, the UN confirmed that although permission had now been given to send about 100 aid trucks into Gaza, no aid had yet been distributed. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer called the current situation intolerable, saying humanitarian aid needs to get in at pace. House of Commons over shouts of shame from MPs as Lammy set out how an Israeli minister had said the latest operations cleansing Gaza, destroying what's left, and relocating Palestinians to third countries. That's not self-defense. That's ethnic cleansing, and worse. We must call it what it is, he told MPs. It is extremism, it is dangerous, it is repellent, it's monstrous, and I condemn it in the strongest possible terms. Lammy had said Israel suffered a heinous attack on 7th of October 2023, and the UK had always backed the country's right to defend itself. However, the Foreign Secretary said the Israeli government had set out on a morally unjustifiable and utterly counterproductive path that would not bring hostages home safely. And again, this is my intermission, that families of the hostages are not convinced this is working. Instead, he accused the government led by Benjamin Netanyahu of isolating Israel from its friends and partners around the world, as he announced negotiations on a free trade deal have been suspended. The Israeli ambassador has been summoned to meet the Middle East Minister Hamish Falconer to convey the message that the Netanyahu's government's actions have made this necessary, he said. Condemning settler violence, Lammy also said sanctions, including asset freezes and travel bans against 3 individuals and 4 companies, are carrying out heinous abuses of human rights. However, Conservative Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Pretty said strong words will do little to resolve the real challenges that are taking place and the suffering we're seeing taking place day in and day out. She added that it should be the cause of concern that the UK's government's actions have been supported by Hamas, a terrorist organisation. Those are crocodile tears from Patel. If she really cared about the suffering, she would bring herself to condemn Israel. You know, recently Kemi Badenoch claimed the Prime Minister lacked, let's put it, to take away the crudeness of it, she claimed he lacked, let's say, courageous fortitude. I'm putting that politely. But frankly, the Tories are being cowardly right now, at least the Tory leadership is. Kemi Badenoch, Priti Patel, and most of the Tory front bench are scared to criticise Israel. Now, I believe this may be because they genuinely support Israel. I mean, in the case of Priti Patel, she has long alleged to have had personal business interests in Israel and personal ties to the country that go beyond her brief. That is certainly morally dubious. Um, I think that, like I say, there is a strong right wing contingent in this country who just blindly support Israel no matter what. I just think it's crocodile tears from her to talk about suffering and yet to condemn Lammy. Actually, there's a little bit more. Excuse me. Excuse me, there's a little bit more in the report. I'll just round this up. There's a few more sentences, so I'll just round this up. Give me 10 sentences or so. Following the statement, there were calls for the Foreign Secretary to go further, including from Labour backbenchers who raised the possibility of a breach of international law. Abdesam Mohammed, the Labour MP for Sheffield Central, said Netanyahu had made an explicit admission that Israeli officials intend to carry out ethnic cleansing. Lammy said the suspension of some arms sales to Israel ensured none of us are complicit in any acts that breach international humanitarian law, but he had announced further measures because the war is still continuing. Well, why just some arms? We can go further than that. Dr. Rosina Allen Khan, the Labour MP for Tooting, also labelled the weaponisation of food as morally reprehensible and called for an arms embargo to be imposed, as well as sanctions on Israeli officials. Lamy gave an absolute commitment that the UK government will take further action if needed over the coming days and weeks. So I hope we're going to see an announcement of a total arms cut off. He also responded to calls to officially recognise the State of Palestine by confirming he was in close dialogue with both France and Saudi Arabia about recognition. Diplomats told the BBC they would still prefer to use recognition of Palestine as a spur to further action, perhaps as part of a wider peace settlement, rather than a symbolic expression of anger against Israel and support for Palestinians. Israeli foreign spokesperson Oren Marmorstein responded defiantly to Lamy's statement the next, saying the decisions on sanctions were unjustified. External pressure will not divert Israel from its path in defending its existence and security against enemies who seek its destruction, he said. Bit like you to seek the destruction of Gaza, then. Mormorstein also suggested the UK government had not been advancing negotiations on the trade deal at all before the announcement in the Commons. If, due to anti-Israel obsession and domestic political considerations, the British government is willing to harm the British economy, that is its own prerogative, he added. Well, that's pretty vain. Israel's a small country. Cutting off trade with Israel will not seriously damage this country. So that's nonsense. Meanwhile, the European Union, Israel's biggest trading partner, is to review its trade agreement with the country in light of its actions in Gaza. I'll put a link to that report. Another report, incidentally, which you'll get in the link to that one, it's about a British medic explaining how difficult situations are there. There is one thing to say about all of this. I believe the government should take stronger measures. I welcome what it's saying. But so long as the United States of America continued supplying Israel the way it does, which is the vast bulk of its arms supplies, I think that is a major, major factor in giving Israel a green light to do what it does. You know, Israel is a small country. It does it does depend on international support. I don't believe that Israel would be standing the way it is if not for American support. So maybe that the only way this ends is for the Trump administration to cut off arms. Now that's not going to happen. But at the very, very least, we can go further, and I hope Bami announces a total cut off of arms this week. Of course, there'll be a chorus of condemnation from the right. There'll be, the pro-Israel lobby in the UK would complain. The likes of the Daily Telegraph, etc., would, try and give the government a lot of heat on it. Tories will complain, Reform will complain, but this is something the government has to do. Um, what I liked about Lammy's statement was the fact he pointed out Conservatives, Margaret Thatcher, William Hague, David Cameron, had taken stances against Israel. In fact, it was the Thatcher government that put sanctions on Israel or cut off arms after Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. So this isn't necessarily a partisan left wing versus right wing issue. It's a question of basic decency. I'm encouraged by the fact that there's conservatives now speaking out. It's grotesque to say that if you're concerned about the suffering in Gaza, you're somehow pro Hamas. That is a lazy reductionist argument, and the government's right to push back hard against that. Um, but they're right. Israel, I'm reluctant at this point to call Israel a friend. I mean, in the past, Israel's compromised the security of British citizens. There was one point where security services were using British passports in a cover operation in identity theft. That was the sort of thing that our so-called allies engaging in. Israel's killed British aid workers. So how much of an ally is it really? Um, this is not to say we should be overly cozy with the Hamas leadership. That goes without saying. In fact, we shouldn't be cozy at all with Hamas. One of the things that's been proposed is Hamas has said it would step down if it stops the airstrikes. Well, there should be pressure put on Hamas to live up to the word and to pledge that they will do that because they're bad news in the region. That always has to be reiterated for two reasons. One, they're a terrorist organization. They deliberately target Israeli civilians. And two, because, you know, they damage the Palestinian cause, actually. And it makes it, I won't say hard, but it kind of, the other reason the government needs to be explicitly anti Hamas is because it strengthens the argument about being pro Palestinian. Actually, I would argue Hamas is just as responsible for the suffering of the Palestinians as Israel is. But Israel is right now, there's no question about that. There is another point, if you want to get into the psychology of it. If someone's seen their entire family killed, all it's just going to do in the long term is be a recruiting agent for Hamas. I would argue actually allowing Israel to have a green light to do as it pleases is a much bigger recruiting tool for Hamas than people expressing sympathy and taking action over the humanitarian suffering in Gaza. So anyway, I welcome the moves by the government. Patel showed herself up. It's a heartless position that she's taking to regurgitate Israeli government propaganda instead of showing any concern or any attempt to criticize Israel in any way, shape, or form. Um, she hasn't criticized Israel once. If that's false, if what the foreign secretary has said is false, the onus is on her to prove otherwise. Let her prove it. Let Pretty Patel condemn what Israel is doing. I noticed she didn't have any sort of update on her Facebook page, so perhaps she knows deep down that he was right. Frankly, I quite like Lammy. I think he's quite a good foreign secretary. I just wish the government would distance itself from China. If they do that, then, when it comes to foreign policy, I'd be relatively happy. They're right about Russia. They're increasingly right about Israel. They need to get it right regarding China and the United States for that matter. In fact, Mark Carney criticised Britain for Starmer's government extending an invitation to Trump. The King's due to visit Canada, and that's going to be a symbolic gesture to show Canadian sovereignty and to show that it's not for sale. But I'm pleased that we had that joint statement with Canada and France. Like I say, this is more about ensuring that we're not on the wrong side of history. Unfortunately, we're going to see, so long as the Trump administration enables Israel, it's going to keep doing what it's doing. Excuse me. Even if there's personal tensions between Netanyahu and Trump, the pro-Israel lobby in the United States is extremely powerful. That shouldn't be underestimated. That is not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Like I say, there's many Jewish Americans who are very against what Israel's doing. And this is an extremely important point because right wingers who support Israel tend to always frame it as an anti Semitic thing. I think it's extremely important that Jewish people are given a voice. Those who criticize Israel, they too have a voice. And ultra right wing Zionists are not the only ones who get to speak. Um, and they can't claim they alone represent the Jewish people. So, of course, actual anti-Semitism must be condemned, but there's a lot of things going on right now, and the truth needs to be told. If Hamas does step down, if they do that, then the onus is on Israel. They can no longer claim Hamas as a threat, at least not to the same extent. If Hamas steps down, if all hostages are released, then the onus is on Israel. Now, I actually think hardliners in Netanyahu's cabinet don't really care about the hostages. I think they're using the hostages as an excuse. I think the real issue here is ethnic cleansing. I think, as they've said, they want to cleanse Gaza. That's what's happening. So I'm going to put the links to the BBC report and the video exchange between Patel and Lammy. But I welcome the Foreign Secretary's comments, and please, they were strong comments. I welcome what the UK government's doing, but I do think we could go further. So 6 out of 10, but we can go further, and it is overdue.